Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for hosting these wonderful sessions. I've really benefited immensely from them. I've really enjoyed every single one of them. And I'm so honored to have been asked to share a short story that certainly hasn't let me go, that I come back to time and time again. Ursula K. LeGuin's, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the text, you just got a brief description, but it's a very short piece, short but rich piece about a utopian city. And the narrator spends quite a lot of time trying to convince the reader of the existence of this perfect place called Omelas. And it goes on and on about how wonderful the city is, only to hit you with a shocking twist. And for those of you who haven't read it, I apologize for the spoiler here. It turns out that Omelas's happiness depends on the horrible abuse and neglect of a child who's locked away in a basement under one of the public buildings. And all of the citizens know about the child. Finding out about it is part of growing up in the city, and pretty much everyone comes to accept it at one point or another, except for these very rare souls who end up deciding to walk away from Omelas, hence the title. And the narrator tells us that this is really the most incredible thing about this incredible city. So before I dive into the details of how I actually teach the text, I thought I'd just say a few words about how and where and why it fits into our syllabus. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Is that? Are you all seeing? You're good? Okay. So the full name of Citizens, Thinkers, Writers is actually Citizens, Thinkers, Writers, Reflecting on Civic Life. And so as you heard from its inception, our program has had this special focus, not just on the theme of citizenship, but on the city. And the program is really structured to have students reflect on what it means to live together in cities by joining in this long tradition of thinking about these questions of what it means to live together in a city. And so we start with the ancient Greek city-states and move forward in time, but also across genres. So in addition to kind of traditional texts of political philosophy, we also look at fiction, plays, poetry, and all that happens in the morning. And then in the afternoons, we have the students connect their readings and discussions to their city, the city of New Haven, through local field trips and sessions with city leaders and officials. And so there have been some tweaks to the syllabus here and there since we first started up in 2016. But one thing that hasn't yet changed is the closing text, the very last thing they read, the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. So here's their last day. And it's a text that works really, really well for us as a kind of culmination of all the themes and questions that they've been thinking about over the course of the 2 weeks. It connects really nicely to the very first thing they read. Here's day 1 and 2. So I actually misled a little bit when I said that we start with Sparta and Athens, because actually their first reading is 2 chapters from Charles Montgomery's Happy City, Transforming Our Lives Through Urban Design. And they also read some selections on citizenship from Aristotle's Politics. And on that first day, you can see here, they're thinking about how the design of a city influences the lives of its citizens, what the relationship is between cities and happiness, what does it mean to be a citizen of a particular city. And since that first day, they've gone on to have great discussions about questioning a city's norms, law and justice, leadership, consent, freedom, injustice, etc. So that's kind of where they've gone through that journey. They're now on the very last day. And our approach to teaching in CTW is always aimed at sparking genuine discussion. And so that means that you can never really predict exactly how the conversations will go or where they will end up. But insofar as there is a kind of plan and rhythm to it, I usually start out just by offering a very brief introduction to the text, a little bit of context that they wouldn't have gotten beforehand. So I tell them it was written in 1973 by Ursula K. Guin, who's an American writer known mainly for her fantasy and science fiction writing. And although they've been reading these different genres, the text is unique in that the city and its people are entirely fictional. And the rest of the class is really all about just, asking the right questions. I really believe that the art of teaching is the art of asking questions. And that's not necessarily to kind of get them to a fixed answer or interpretation, but to just help them get a better sense of which questions it is that really matter to them and why, and of course to give them the space to work through those questions together along with the insights of their peers. So I then suggest some of the big questions that the story raises, questions again that they've been exploring throughout the program, right? So I might say something like, what makes a happy city? How do we deal with injustice? What are the foundations of government and what can or should be done if there is something rotten in them? Is happiness even possible without injustice? I kind of let that sit for a moment, and then I pivot to much lower stakes question to kind of get each of them talking and to lower the bar of entry to the conversation, right? And also give me a better sense of where they are. And so I asked each of them to offer their kind of initial reactions to the story, but I limit them to 1 or 2 words, right? So how would they, in just 1 or 2 words, describe the story and their experience reading it? And I find that, keeping it to 1 or 2 words ensures I get a sense of what they're feeling without, risking launching too quickly into tangents or getting too, chaotic. Because one of the things I've found with this story in particular is that students are always ready to get to the big reveal, the big secret, right? They want to talk about the child in the closet. That's the thing that's really foremost in their mind and that's sticking with them. And so it's really key to get them to slow down, to pay careful attention to that first part of the story. And so students will typically say things like shocking truth, odd, depressing, surprising, roller coaster. And once all of that is on the table, I say, okay, well, we're going to look at the story in its 3 parts, right? The beginning, the twist, and then the ending. And so I asked them, let's start with what's so great about Omelas. What's it like, right? Why is it a utopia? And I always try to, press them to show me examples from the text. So we talk about its different characteristics, how it's by the water, has red roofs, how there's this festival of summer going on. The people are celebrating. There's lots of music and horses and children running around naked and dancing, right? And how the people are happy, but they're not simple. They're not simple. There are few rules and laws. There's no king, there's no knights, no slaves, no swords, no advertisements, et cetera, et cetera. And we also talk about what the citizens are like. They're described as mature and intelligent and passionate adults who are no less complex than us and who, interestingly, have no guilt. And I have them reflect, on these descriptions, the utopia. And I asked, does it seem real to them? Because after all, the narrator seems very intent on convincing us, the readers, that this place is a real place, right? The narrator seems to think we won't believe that it's a real place, that we'll think it's all a fantasy. Why this anxiety? Is the narrator right? And that leads us to the conclusion that the underlying problem, at least to the narrator's mind, is that we seem to have these certain beliefs about happiness that get in the way of our being able to believe in the utopia. So then we move to a discussion about what is happiness and what are our assumptions about it, right? Is it true that we associate happiness or a kind of utopia with the past or with being naive? Is it true that we think evil and pain is more interesting or more intellectual somehow? And we focus on this key line here. Happiness is based on a just discrimination of what is necessary, what is neither necessary nor destructive, and what is destructive. And we talk about how the narrator deals with our supposed assumptions about happiness and the subjectiveness of what we might consider, necessary versus necessary and not destructive. Talk about the problem of whether the same utopia could actually please everyone. And we also look at how the narrator really invites the reader to collaborate in imagining the city in this unique way, right? The reader gets this odd kind of freedom. And so the narrator will say things like, here's what I think about the kind of technology that the city has in it. But you decide, whatever helps make the city more believable to you is great. And, we talk about why the narrator would say things like, it would be better for there to be religion, but no clergy or no manned temples. and no soldiers and those kind of things. And then, we come back to the repeated worry that, the narrator has, that the readers will confuse happiness with being goody-goody. So the readers are invited to imagine that the city has orgies and non-addictive drugs like drews, right? All in service of trying to make us believe. And so I pressed the students about the believability of the city and whether it is really possible to imagine a truly happy city. And I think many times when this text is taught, and some of the students may have read it in an English class before, it really focuses on the question being raised in this kind of more abstract way by the city of whether happiness somehow needs or depends on misery, and whether and at what point the suffering of some or many is worth or one, I guess, is worth the happiness of some or many or one, right? It's taught as a meditation on or a critique of utilitarianism. But I like to push them to really confront these questions in a different way by having them think about art and the actual experience of reading the story. Because I think that's really one of the most fascinating things that LeGuin's done with this story is there's a challenge here to think about our own desires.
12-hour flight. The second they took off, they knew. I knew. The second they took off.
Oh, David, I think you might need to mute yourself. Hello? Sorry, Stephanie, forgive me. We'll figure out how to do this. Hold on.
Okay. Right. So I think there's a challenge here for us to think about our own desires and expectations around art and storytelling, because it's not just the city that needs the child in the story, right? It's the story itself. We don't tell stories that go, once upon a time, there was a happy city, the end, right? The story itself somehow needs the child, not just the city of Omelas. And so at this point, in the conversation, I'll go back to this line in particular, the treason of the artist. And we'll talk about, what does that mean? And that can then open up all sorts of questions about the role of art and the artist in society, what political responsibility, if any, the artist has, what do our demands that we place on art say about us, and about, what we think about society. And then I ask whether it all works, right? Whether the narrator actually succeeds in convincing them, whether the story seems somehow, more believable when you find out about the secret. And at this point, they finally get to talk about the child, which they are always eager to do. And it's heartbreaking. There's so much to unpack and try to make sense of. And so it's one of the passages that we'll usually actually read together aloud in full. So I'll give you part of that experience, right? So it says, it could be a boy or a girl. It looks about 6, but actually is nearly 10. It is feeble-minded. Perhaps it was born defective, or perhaps it has become imbecile through fear, malnutrition, and neglect. It picks its nose and occasionally fumbles vaguely with its toes or genitals as it sits haunched in the corner farthest from the bucket and the 2 mops. It is afraid of the mops. It finds them horrible. It shuts its eyes, but it knows the mops are still standing there, and the door is locked, and nobody will come. The door is always locked, and nobody ever comes, except that sometimes the child has no understanding of time or interval. Sometimes the door rattles terribly and opens, and a person or several people are there. One of them may come and kick the child to make it stand up. The others never come close, but peer at it with frightened, disgusted eyes. The food bowl and the water jug are hastily filled. The door is locked. The eyes disappear. The people at the door never say anything, but the child, who has not always lived in the tool room and can remember sunlight and its mother's voice, sometimes speaks. I will be good, it says. Please let me out. I will be good. They never answer. The child used to scream for help at night and cry a good deal, but now it only makes a kind of whining, ee-ah, ee-ah, and it speaks less and less often. It is so thin that there are no calves to its legs. Its belly protrudes. It lives on a half bowl of cornmeal and grease a day. It is naked. Its buttocks and thighs are a mass of festered sores as it sits in its own excrement continually. So we kind of sit with that, right? And we look closely and we know the child has not always lived in the tool room and can remember sunlight and its mother's voice. So, all sorts of questions arise. How did the child get there? Does the child ever leave and get replaced by a new child? Is the child condemned to grow old and die there? It seems important that it's a child though somehow, so why a child? And why that specific child? I mean, the line, I will be good, please let me out, I will be good. And how the only way the child can make sense of what's happening is to think that it's somehow punishment for something that they did, as though a child could ever do something that would deserve that kind of treatment. And then we focus in on how all of the people of Omelas know that the child is here, right? Many of them have come to see it, others are fine to know that it's there, but it's key that it's not just some hidden secret. It's part of the children's education. It's part of their growing up to learn about it. The children learn, right, about it when they're between 8 and 12, and they feel awful at first. They want to do something, right? They feel outraged. They feel helpless though, too. And so they end up rationalizing and accepting the way that things are, right? That their happiness, the beauty of their city, the tenderness of their friendships, et cetera, depend on the child's being there. And in the end, I mean, it really doesn't make sense to sacrifice the happiness of thousands for just one child, right? So we do a close reading of this passage in particular and try to unpack what's meant by the odd line, right? They know that they, like the child, are not free. In what sense are they not free? Can there be freedom in suffering? And it is because of the child that they are so gentle with their children. So then I'll ask them something like, have you had a moment of peering in the basement or of realizing some horrible truth about society or the things that you take for granted that changes how you see the world around you? Right? Are there moments like that that you've had where you felt like you learned the world isn't what you thought it was? Great set of questions, especially for that age, right? And that usually leads to a discussion about what the child could represent and the ways in which it does seem true that maybe a lot of the happiness and good things that we take for granted depend on or come at the cost of the suffering of others in some way. And depending on the year and the group, the political issues or current events that are really salient at the time, each conversation is different. I remember one year, the story landed with this particular punch because the students were thinking about the children literally in cages at the border when we were teaching. And sometimes we'll also talk about education, right? What it means to come of age in society, what does and does not get taught about the world. How can you and should you teach about injustice? And again, it's interesting that the problem in the city is not that people don't know about the child, right? They all know about the injustice. It's not really an education problem that's making the difference. And so then in the final part of the class, moving to part 3, I ask whether there are any heroes in the story and get into that claim the narrator makes that the most incredible thing of all is that there are those who walk away. And I ask them, would you walk away from Omelas? Right? And this ends up being an especially unpredictable moment in the conversation because how they see the ones that walk away can really vary, right? Are they heroes for refusing the terms of the social contract? Are they foolish idealists who, should have just accepted that it is what it is and you take the happiness you can get, or are they cowards who gave up when they should have stayed and tried to do something about the injustice, even if everyone thought it would be unwise or impossible. And we talk about the uncertainty of where the ones who walk away go and the significance of the fact that they go alone, that they're never coming back. And how the students respond to all of this depends on how willing I think they are to accept that there's truly no way out of the terms. So depending on where they are, I kind of press different sides and different arguments you could make for and against walking away. And I also try to link them back to earlier discussions they've been having about consent and resistance. And I try to get them to think about whether it really matters whether true justice and happiness is possible without injustice and unhappiness, whether there's value in just trying anyway, right? Even if another child is going to end up in the closet. So could we really say there's anything heroic in the kind of hopeless critique and rejection of the terms of the city? Is there nothing in between a kind of blind idealism and hopeless realism? And, we talk about how growing up and learning about different kinds of injustice in the world can feel really overwhelming, but to keep in mind the unit that we focus on, this city. And this is where we kind of try to pivot into something a little more uplifting, because you can't necessarily single-handedly change the world or your whole country, right? But you can certainly make an impact on your communities and on your city. And I remind them, of all the people that they've met who are trying to do just that. And so even if the story is kind of dark and unsettling, we do try to end on this kind of positive note about focusing on what you can do at the local level, and not, necessarily giving up and walking away. And that preps them nicely, I think, for what comes after the summer, when they become CTW fellows. We meet monthly with them, and they work together on a project that aims to give back to the city in some way. So this year they're planning an event for younger students in New Haven Public Schools, where they are going to teach Antigone, which they really loved reading over the summer, and kind of host a discussion about it. And I think it also links up nicely to helping them think about, their relationship to the city, especially as they kind of agonize over where to apply to college and how far away to go, and if they ever want to come back, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess to sum up, I'm leaving a lot of time for questions, but this is sort of the sketch I have in mind for the flow and the themes of the conversation. And then I just try to ask the right questions at the right moments to keep pressing and deepening the conversation.